Hi there, hello, my name's Lines, great to see you. Now, today we're doing another one-to-one speed, real-time draw along. We're going to go through and draw this. We'll do it all real-time, do the sketch, line art, coloring, shading, post-processing, and I'll talk through the entire process the entire way. Now, if you like these, I've got a whole bunch of them here on a playlist, and if you want to do more targeted study, I've got all my tutorials on the channel over in this playlist as well. Now, all my videos do typically have homework. With these video series, the drawing you do, if you choose to follow along, is your homework. So I'd love to see that if you'd like to pop into the Discord and post it there. We've got a great community, and you can post your other artwork, chat with other artists, have all sorts of fun. Also, I do apologize for sounding a bit croaky on the recording, but today's my recording day, so this is what we're going with. Now, if you like what you see, and you'd like to see more of it, consider subscribing, liking, let me know in the comments what sort of things you'd like to do in these real-time draw-alongs in future, or in the tutorials I make. In the meantime, let's get stuck in. Alright, so let's begin. I've got my big intimidating canvas here ready to fill. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put some guidelines in for myself because I want to do a rule of thirds composition. So I'm just going to put in and just pencil in very gently, very relaxedly, very sort of slowly, roughly where the third lines are going to be. You could use a ruler, but you don't really need to. Rule of thirds composition, there's nothing measured to the millimeter or anything. It's just broadly put things on those rhythmic points. Either, just the vertical ones or the horizontal ones. In this case, I'm going to do both. Now, if you're interested in composition, I do have my composition video I spent a month and a half making. So if you do want to have a look at that, have a go of it. It's probably one of the better things I've put forward. Hopefully it's a very useful resource for you. Now with this one, I've got my third lines all sort of lined up very broadly, and I'm going to start putting in my basic shapes. Now, one of the shapes I go with, the shapes I go with initially in any given drawing tend to be my primary bone masses. That's the skull, the rib cage, and the pelvis. They're really good starting points when you're building out a figure, since they're very static, unlike the rest of the body, which is quite dynamic because it's very fleshy, whereas your skull is a big, hard lump of bone that doesn't really change shape. And the same thing is true for your rib cage and pelvis. So with the head there, the spine, I'm just sort of figuring out with a little stick figure here where I want their arms to go, roughly. I want them making the sort of the love heart shape. Apparently every generation has its own sort of love heart shape, someone was telling me after I finished this one, so that's fun. This one I got from a music poster from the 60s or 70s, so I'm not sure what generation that is. I guess this is the boomer heart. I'm just doing a vague idea of how I want the hands to look. I'll come in and do the hands properly later. I'm just sort of figuring out what sort of silhouette I want for them and what sort of shape. And then doing a little sort of stick figure elbows and forearms there. And now, just sort of rounding around the bit of the head, just making sure the ball's okay, and then starting with a sort of guide line down the center line of the face, and a rough line for where I want the head to go, and then an eye line coming across. And then digging in for the cheek, just to get that basic shape in there. And now I'll get that sort of flat plane for the side of the head, which isn't exactly completely flat against the side of the head. It sort of tilts in a little bit at the bottom. Or it can do anyway. You can have it sort of tilt out if you've got a very sort of strong jawed character. Now this one I'm going to add a unicorn horn on their head, and just rough in about where I want the volume of the hair to be. Since this picture is going to be very much based around the sort of the head and shoulders, I just want to make sure the shape of the feature point, which is going to be the face and hands, is getting the right sort of shape. I'll come in and detail it properly in a bit, but for now, you'll notice I've also broken the eye line up into thirds, and that's thirds indented in. The eyes sit into the head, they don't sit sort of out and proud. You'll notice with your eyebrows and eyes, from the front, they're in the same position, or they're vertically in line. But when you look at the head from the side, they're no longer vertically in line anymore. And so that's because the eyes sit inset into the head. And so now I'm just giving them some long hair, maybe some ponytail, just thinking where I want them where the hair to be. They've got a unicorn horn on the front, so I feel like a ponytail on the back is, it fits. It's thematically on brand. And so I'm just penciling out some of the shapes here. And while I do that, I'm thinking about what sort of image I want to make. We could do a color image, we could do a black and white image. The last one we did for these draw-alongs was monochrome. That's this image right here. But monochrome is a bit sort of binary, very, you know, black and white. So we'll be moving away from that today to make more of a sort of non-binary image, I think. And, you know, to that end, I'm seeing a lot of other artists doing a lot of really cheerful, rainbowy, colory images this month, which is great. So I might have a go as well. You know, make something we can all take pride in. Now, getting a bit of a vague shape there for us, like a big puffy jacket for them to wear, with big sort of fluffy fur trim. Because I feel like a unicorn horn goes quite naturally well with sort of fur trim. Well, it's my view anyway. And then just remembering that the jacket will have the sort of non-fur trim bit as well under it. And since the hand is coming forward, I'm remembering to angle that line upwards. And now adding a little sort of singlet there. I think Yanks call it like a tank top. Is that what we call it? Yeah, singlet. We have another name for it, but I'm not saying that on YouTube. I'll get demonetized terribly. And now a bit of the sort of puffy part of the jacket coming out the bottom. And just sort of figuring where I want it to be. I think I might have both the shoulders out from the jacket. Because I think sort of the uncovered shoulders looks really nice. Especially with the jacket, you get that sort of nice, really disturbed silhouette to it. You know, like a human figure silhouette looks cool, but disturbing that silhouette with a really alien shape to that form can be really nice. So now I'm just going to do some rough penciling in of what sort of shapes I want for the hands. So again, I'm not going to do super detailed work here, but I just want to sort of decide where the bits are going to go. So I've got that palm, you can see there from the side, and that big triangular section next to it is the mass next to the thumb. If you look at your hand, there's not really any muscles in your hand. The only real muscles there are actually in your hand itself are the ones that articulate your thumb, with little ones there responsible for wiggling your fingers left and right. But the rest of the movement in your fingers is actually done by the muscles in your forearms. There's very little actual mass in the hand that's muscle, except for that big muscle that sits next to the thumb that's responsible for gripping. And now we're just going to do the rest on the other hand there. Now, apart from that big muscle on the thumb for gripping, the other sort of masses on the hand are more like sort of grip pads. You can notice that there's one on the palm, on the thumb. There's another one on the other side that runs up the ridge of the hand, and another one that sits just below the fingers. They're in sort of the same spot as like a cat's paw. And so it's worth remembering then, whenever you have a hand drawn from the side, not to draw the palm as a flat thing. It's more like a whiskey flask with extra bulgy bits on that inside concave edge. But again, if you're interested in hands, I do have a video on how to draw hands. More people should watch it. More people should draw hands. They're just as expressive as the face and twice as hard. Now, just getting a bit more detail on the thumb there, just getting a vague shape in, and for where I want the sort of bulgy bits of the palm to be. And then thinking where I want the sort of creases of the gloves to be, I want to communicate a lot of the shape of this figure using the silhouette and the broken silhouette with clothing, with little wrinkles and folds and creases. You don't even have to do any of the internal details with a very stylized image, so long as you have good little marks and bumps for creases. One great example of this is the artist from Helltaker, if you've heard of it. Very little known title, I know. But yeah, the artist, I think they're Van Ripper. They've got a great line in implied detail, especially of fabric behavior, with just having a little bit of creases and folds around the edges. It looks absolutely gorgeous. There's a new one too, I think Alivari? Someone will tell me in the comments. Now, just doing a bit of the fluffy bit around there on the shoulder bit of the jacket, and then fleshing out some of the hair. They're just sort of tuning the shapes as I go. And now I might start moving on to doing some of the parts of the face. So I'm getting an eraser, and you'll notice I never completely erase when I'm sketching. This is important to sort of do, just because if you have like a really hard eraser, like you just like delete an area out, you don't really have that information on where it used to be. I'm just pulling that head down. The neck was a bit long. And the reason I'll do the partial erasing whenever I erase is I want to be able to see my previous missed shots. If you imagine you're doing sort of archery and you let go of the shot and you see that the arrow is too low. So that tells you you need to tilt it back a bit. You fire another one, it sits too high. So you move it down a bit. Those missed shots aren't without value. Those missed shots are the scaffolding elements you use to get the shot that actually hits the target. And so the same thing's true here. Whenever I've got a sketch, I'll try and keep some of it and I'll build on it with sketching. So I'll partially erase and then build on top. Now I'll do a little wink here because I think that's adorable. And you can see I've got the planes to the face there, so I've dug in where the eyes are, and then from that area, I'll come and stick it out for where the nose sits. Coming back to that artist, Van Ripper, they're probably more responsible for the noses on my characters than anyone else. Their work is just gorgeous. I will stop, gushing about them, but their work is just absolutely phenomenal. Okay. Alright. Now, just erasing out some elements there. Making the nose maybe a little bit pointier. Make the features a bit finer. And then dig in there, the line where the cheekbone's going to go. So maybe round the chin a bit. One of my sticking points is the jawline. I'll be, if left to my own devices, I'll sit there redoing the jaw for forever. But on this one, I'm just going to make sure I don't spend too long on it, because this drawing's going to be long enough with a relatively detailed illustration. Now, I'll start getting a bit of an idea for how I want the coiling shape around the horn there. Getting those sort of the coiling shape around a tapering object can be a bit tricky. So I'm just trying to get that curve done there. And for the sake of the video production, I'm not rotating the canvas, but I recommend you do actually rotate the canvas when you're drawing this, just because it's so much easier to get a curve to draw a curve when you've got that on the left-hand side of your right hand, or if you're left-handed, on the right-hand side of your left hand. You'll notice your wrist has a natural sort of curve to its movement when you move the wrist, and so it's best when you are drawing a curve to naturally try to fit it into that flow. And so here I'm going to do the big grin. I'll draw the teeth line a bit sort of higher up there instead of around the middle, just to sort of make it look like a bit of a lower angle. And putting a bit of a testing there for where I want sort of thicker upper lashes, which look quite pretty. And making the nose a bit maybe rounder. I like a bit of a round nose. And then starting on my eternal battle with the line of the jaw. Well, that's coming out pretty strongly already, which is nice to see. And I'm just going to grab the eye there and just shuffle it over. One of the things I'll typically do is, if I'm drawing a head at an angle, I'll draw the iris at not at an angle, which is a known issue. So I've just got to remember to rotate the image a bit, so I can then have the iris at an angle as well. And so here I'm just planning out where the start and end point of the winking eye needs to be, since the sides of it have to be sort of, well, you break up the eye line into thirds, with the middle of the eyes being a gap that is the same size as one of the eyes. So you essentially break it up into thirds. First third is an eye, middle third is nothing, last third is another eye. And then adding a little piercing there. I feel like piercings look nice. I don't know if piercings are still in these days. Back in my day. They're all sort of very cool, having piercings every which way. Had a bunch myself. It looked like I'd lost a fight with a stapler. Now, a bit more on the eye there. Remembering that little crease that sits above the eye. I'm forever sort of forgetting to put it there, but it makes such a difference having that, just that little crease that sits above the upper eyelash. And then putting in where I want the eyebrows to be. Sort of lifting the eyebrows up there to have them sort of spaced further away from the face to make it look sort of, cuter, or... And then let's do a bit more of a stroke down there just to sort of shape then that top of the head, where the hair leads into the two sort of low ponytails, or twin tails? I don't know what they're called. And then putting some detail on the ear there. One good thing you can do with the ear, whenever you're spacing it and placing it, is remembering that the eye line, so the midpoint of the eyes, will line up to the top of where the ear attaches. So if you imagine a pair of imaginary glasses, you'll notice that the arms on glasses always go directly back horizontally. That's because the eyes are always level with the top of the ear. And then the bottom part of the ear will usually line up with the mouth, and then that long edge of the ear will typically fall very close to in line with the line of the jaw. It's almost like you follow the line of the jaw back, and it joins straight up with the flow of the back of the ear. Now I'm just putting a little collar on there. I think that'll look really nice. Really cute. And finishing off a bit of line for the top of the head. It's not my most organised approach to an image, this one. It was, you know, may have had a case of the sniffles while I worked through this one, but I got through it by golly. And then just a little part for the hair there. I was tossing up whether to have the horn splitting the hair or just having the horn sort of stuck on top, and I decided to go with option 2 because I figured it looked nice. And then doing the top of the hair there, trying not to overemphasize the hair intakes. They're a bit of a... If you grew up with a lot of sort of 90s and early 2000s anime, the hair intakes are a very big part of any character, but I've got to sort of dial them back if I can. They're a bit gauche, I think is the word these days. And I've just put a little mark there, just to sort of remind me to come back to that bit of the neck. There's something about the neck there that I wasn't quite sure about, so I put a little mark to let myself know to come back, instead of just sitting there and, you know, beating my head against that part of the image and just having it go nowhere. Give myself a break, go work on something else, and leave a little mark to remind myself to come back and fix it later. And so now I'm just going to do the hair coming around the side on the right-hand side. And thinking where I want the sort of hair baubles to be that are going to gather the hair up. And then throwing a bit of sort of dark area there around the teeth to make sure that works okay. And then the shoulder, just getting the shape right there for it and the shape of the singlet next to it. Or a tank top to go over the top of it as well. And then a little sort of tag thing on the collar. It's a little sort of love heart shape, I think that'd be quite cute. And then the shoulder coming up. And I want to sort of lift the shoulder there, so we've got to remember that since the shoulders are hinged with the collarbone, so the collarbone can essentially be thought of as like the super secret extra upper arm. There's another joint that goes from the collarbone to the shoulder, and the shoulder to the elbow. So it's essentially the second elbow in the process of the arm. You need to move that shoulder by hinging it in the center of the rib cage there, and rotating it with the collarbone. And now I'm just going to sort of shape the ponytail on the left-hand side here. It's going to probably be one of the few sort of features in this area of space. And I want the thing to overall have a fair bit of detail. I want to have a fair bit going on with this one. And so I've given it a bit of sort of space around it to frame it. And I'm going to have a bit of detail there, whereas the other ponytail is going to be sitting behind the shoulder and hand, so it won't be as sort of obvious. And that's looking okay. I'm just taking a bit of a broader view at it to sort of check to make sure everything's looking alright. But I'm happy with where it's headed. Alright. Now, I'm just going to move some of the features around a bit. So what I've done here, as you may have noticed through the wonders of movie magic, I took a bit of a cup of tea break, and I've come back and thought, oh no, this is all in the wrong spot. So it's really important with any time you do a sketch, take a minute or two, take a break, have a look outside, have a cup of tea, and it'll really help you see sort of what parts of it need adjusting and in what ways. So I've just took a bit of a break and seen there's a few things there I need to tune up and tune in. Get that sort of hair in the right spot. I want that to come in and around sort of even with the mouth in perspective. And that bit there where I left that little asterisk, I can see what the issue is with the neck. I was starting it at the wrong point, and I wasn't being angular enough with it for that change in direction, because it's quite a gentle sort of curve when you go from the neck to the head, but the neck to the hair can be a different thing. Since the hair adds some more volume, it means it can sharpen that angle a bit. So that was the issue there I'd been having. So here I'm just sort of planning for what I'm going to have in the line art. So the jawline does go the entire length from the ear to the chin, but in this case, I'm actually not going to have that line art there. I'm going to have that be implied. And I might be illustrating it with a bit of sort of shading or tone, but I'm not going to have that indicated with line art. And now I'm just getting the sort of final shape of the hair detailing, so things like the strands of hair, And then just neatening up this jawline again, because again, I have a problem. I think this is probably getting me there. I'm very unlikely to fix up the jaw again. He says, knowing full well that he will. So, and then making sure to get that face a bit sort of concave, giving your teeth to be a bit concave on the right-hand side to show that depth. That on one side it'll come out, on the other side it'll sort of come in. And our flipped canvas as a good way to sort of see where things need to be. And I want to have a bit of the hair framing the face on both sides. So coming down in, I think they're called the bangs. I'm not sure what the side bangs are called. I think maybe they're not even called bangs. Might be using the wrong words for that. And so I'm just getting a bit of a broad view of it. And then I'm going to lower the opacity, make a new layer, and then merge it with the new layer. And now I'll have this, essentially the same as just gently rubbing out the whole thing. But now that I've got the base shapes where I want them, I'm going to go over and do my more refined sketch, which is the one just before I do my line art. Now you might have a neat enough sketch that you don't need to do this step, in which case, skip ahead in the video. But for me, I like to have my base shapes separated in my workflow from my more refined shapes. That way I know sort of what I'm working with at a given time. So if I'm working with my simplified shading, I don't have to worry about getting my detail elements in. And then once I'm on my detail elements, I can just trust that I've got my volumes and shapes and overall proportions right before I move on. And so now I'm just going a bit more onto the detail and adding a bit more on things like the eyebrow there. Not the eyebrow, sorry, the eyelashes, the upper eyelashes. And just sort of getting the rough shapes right. Now that I've got the positions for everything, so this is sort of the layer where, or at least the step where, I go in and get my detail elements correct. Whereas the step prior is where I'm getting my volumes and shapes in the right positions. You know, head in the right place, arms in the right place. Just breaking those jobs into little sections for myself really helps me not get overloaded with different things. I can just do one thing at a time, which really helps when drawing is a whole bunch of things. But if you do a whole bunch of things, one thing at a time, it's like running a marathon. You can't jump a marathon the whole way, but you can take a lot of little steps. And so here I'm just doing the horn, which is essentially the same sort of cylinder it was, or sorry, cone it was before, but I just put little notches out of the edges there. So I'll start with, like I said before, my base shape, which is a cone, and then I'll take the detail into it. So I'll take little notches out of it. And so here I'm just adding in things like the finalized line on the nose, or the little, I think it's a septum piercing from memory. I think it's a septum piercing. And then just getting the hair in. I should probably flip the canvas of this. I just don't want to flip it too much as part of the video because I just don't want to flip the canvas too much as part of the video because it makes it visually a bit hard to follow if I ever want to sort of speed the footage up. Normally moving the canvas around a lot is good, but if you're like me and you have to record it for the internet, playing that at double speed can be quite tough on the senses for everyone else. So I'm trying to get into the habit of not moving my camera very much, but move yours plenty. There you go. That's getting the shape of the teeth in there. I do quite like the sort of cartoony simplified teeth of one big sort of unified bar. And then just the eye in as well. And then starting on the line of the face there. Coming all the way down the jaw, and you can see that's what I mentioned before with that bottom edge of the ear is almost parallel to the line of the jaw, and then where it joins the head is level with the eye. Now since the head is tilted back a bit, that eye line is going to bow upwards, sort of like the rim on a tin can. It's flat, but if you tilt the can away from you, it becomes rounded. And now we can just start detailing out the collar. again, this is just the detail sketch. None of this is going to be kept. This is just me getting the shapes right. So I've got enough information here for me to go over and ink it when the time comes. And so just adding in the detail of the collar here. I've got a second window there with Google Images of a collar. I always get confused with the sort of the latchy, bolty, strappy bits on anything with a buckle. So I had to get a reference there. I think it's a fairly expensive looking collar from the thing I pulled up in the other window. If I can find it on my search history, I'll link it here. But if I can't, well, you know, it was probably a very expensive looking collar for very fancy dogs. Just down the other side as well. And then just getting the hair joining the back of the neck there. One of the things I really like is a little sort of loose bit of hair. Whenever you have hair tied up, there's a little bit of like the shorter hairs that grow down the neck, and there's a little sort of ringy, tough bit. I always think they look fairly appealing, really cute, so I always sort of add them whenever I can. Now I'm going to give them an earring. I think they look nice with it. And I'm going to put a little bit of detail in the ear, but I realized I put it in the wrong spot. I always sort of forget the little soft, gummy bit at the bottom of the ear there. I don't have them myself. I just sort of cut off early. And just smoothing that jawline again, because again I have attachment issues with getting the jawline right. It's a known issue. We're working towards. We're needs improvement. We're assessing opportunities. It's a known issue. I think that's all the ways I know to say something's going wrong. And now just nice smooth lines. Get the shoulder up here. Been pretty tight. I'm just getting a bit of a sort of second pair of eyes on it. There we are. And now giving it a rotate. This is what I talked about before with some curves are much easier to make depending on the angle you're trying to draw them on. So the top of the head is really easy to draw if it's curved to the left of your right hand. And so I'm flipping it again to do these curves here more reliably. Now, if you're left-handed, of course, other way around, and you can do it by either rotating the canvas or you can flip canvas to do it the other way around. Either will work. Just keeping on around the edge of the hair there. And having it sort of flare out towards the end. That's one of the things, if you've seen my hair video, one of the things I talk about in that is that hair is one of the unattached elements of the body. It is still attached, but the reason I call it unattached is that musculature and bones tend to have a couple of points that they attach with, whereas hair, breasts, body fat, they're all things that are defined by the environment. So your musculature isn't defined by the environment. You can hang upside down and your muscles all sit in the same spot. Whereas if you hang upside down, your hair will flow down because it's affected by gravity and, you know, wind and movement. And so one of the things you'll notice with hair is that the flaring out that it does and the curling and all the other sort of expressions of its sort of material type, those become strongest at the very ends, because at the very top of your hair, it's got all the hair below it pulling it down and pulling it straight. Whereas as you get further from that point, there's less hair weighing it down from below. And at the very end, there's no hair weighing it down from below. So if it's curly, it'll curl like crazy. But it'll always curl more towards the ends of hair. Unless it's so curly it can ignore all, and in that case you have an afro. And that's cool, but, you know, different hair. And now just getting that shoulder there. And an edge of the sort of the tufty fuzz of the jacket. And then starting on the fingers here, trying to make sure they're not sort of too thick. I have a habit of making the fingers too thick because I tend to base the hands in my drawings on my own hands. And my hands are essentially a bunch of bananas. They're they're pretty big. If any of you are familiar with salad fingers, it's roughly that sort of experience. Now, one of the things is, though, that whenever I use my own hands for a reference, it's really good for getting things like the parts and proportions, but it means the fingers and thumbs tend to be a lot thicker than some of the characters you would expect them to have. So not terribly dainty. So this one here, I'm doing them in gloves, which helps cover some of that sin, but not all of it. And so you can see there I'm doing the outline with a little sort of bump and crease there around the wrist. I haven't actually done the folds, but that little bump there gives the outline the impression that there are internal folds in that shape. And I'm just mortified that I've probably gotten the thumbs around the wrong way, but I think I've got them right. I look forward to the day that as an artist, I can draw a hand and not look down at my own hand to make sure the thumb's on the right side. But that's one of my art goals. And now I'm just going to do the outside edge of the palm there. And really try to keep in mind those big pads of the palm. The palm is just not a flat thing. It just really isn't. Like, you can cup water in your palm. You can keep it like a tablespoon of water just in your palm. Now, if you were going to draw a tablespoon, you'd be drawing a really big sort of concave surface. If you draw a palm, you should. It's the same concave surface. So there's a lot of big, bulgy sort of ridges in the palm that it's important to try and make sure you capture to give the hand that depth. And so now I'm doing a little bit of the edge of the glove on the right side. I'll start working my way down the arm on the left side. Now here you can see when I'm doing little tufty bits there, I'll do a big bit, a little bit, a medium-sized bit, a big bit, and I won't, where possible, let myself repeat the same shapes one after another. If you do the same size pieces repeatedly, it'll kind of look like a saw blade or whatever sort of shape it looks like. It won't look like fur. Fur has an innate irregularity. It's one of those things like, hair, fur, the cracks in rock, anything that's supposed to have an organic, natural pattern to it. Those things, it's important to make sure that you don't have any repeating patterns or repeating rhythms of elements, because that will make the thing look more mechanical and it will take away a lot of that sort of naturalistic feel from it. And now I'm just doing a bit of the inside edge of the jacket there. Bottom bit of the big sleeve. And so since there's already a lot of detail on like the wrists and hands, I'm going to let there be a bit of a rest area around just behind the sort of fur trim of the jacket. Typically I shouldn't actually leave that as an undetailed section, but it's just so heavy in detail already that I'm just going to see if I can get away with it and not have the detail right near it. Normally you would get a lot of detail there because that's where the jacket will gather. If you imagine like a hoodie you're wearing, and you've got like elastic sleeves or anything sort of cinching around the wrist, it means that there'll be a lot of compression behind that where the clothing is bunching up around it. But in this one, I decided I didn't want to do that, and I think I got away with it. Now I'm just alluding to the ponytail on the right hand side, and there's a couple of shapes that it's going to go behind and still show up in front of, so I'm just wanted to make sure I've got all the information there for myself when I do the actual line art. So I'm just going to come back to that in a sec. And here I'm just doing a bit of a test tone section on the eyes there, just to make sure it reads okay. I won't have to do it for one of the eyes, of course, because it's closed. I was thinking of doing the character, because I was thinking the character would look really nice, very colourful, but what might sort of add to that was giving them, I think it's heterochromia, the thing we have like the different sort of coloured eyes, and I didn't think like that would sort of fit. I was going to have like really like colourful hair and clothing on them, so I figured the whatever hetero eyes wouldn't really fit with the character. It didn't really sort of fit that sort of vibe, so I decided just to close one eye, because I mean if it's just got multicoloured eyes and multicoloured hair, it'll all sort of blend. It'll be much too sort of fluid, although that can look good if it's quite fluid sometimes. Alright. good sort of look there. I've just got my lasso tool up. I'm just going to move some of the elements around a little bit. I'm going to grab the arms, and we're just going to make the arms come out a bit. You know, it can be a bit tricky, but we're just going to make the arms come out a bit because, you know, having to come out can be tricky, but in the end, it really helps give you the right impression. It's always worth it, even if it is a bit challenging to come out. And once they're in just the right place, it turns out it was just the right thing to do after all. If you think of doing the same thing with your drawing, you know, coming out. And I'm just going to do a bit of an adjustment there on the shoulder as well, and just have that come out as well. Move it over a little bit there. Yeah, I see that's exactly what it's meant to be. Yeah. I'm definitely very comfortable with that, and if, you know, no one else is comfortable with it, well, that's mine, and that's where I've decided it's going to be. And now I'm just going to neaten things up, because there can be a bit of an adjustment period after something like that, but you can see, even if it does take a bit of adjustment afterwards, it's very, very easy to make those small adjustments and fill in any gaps after the change there. And now I'm just going to do a bit more around the fur trim on the side there. And then one of the things is the line work for the hair there. It's just gotten sort of picked up a bit, so I'm just going to straighten sort of those bits out. Although, I have to straighten them out. Not everything has to be straight. Now, I'm just doing a bit of the jacket as well, that sort of inside edge of the jacket, coming down the midsection. And then do some just nice big sweeping lines for where I want the hair to be, from the ponytail on the right, or their left side, my right? Yeah, my right. Our right. And I'm just having a bit of a confusing moment with the shapes under the hand there. I've got the fur trim of the jacket, the arm of the jacket, and the fingers and the hair. I probably should have color-coded this bit. You'll notice in a lot of my multi-subject drawings, I'll actually do one, if I've got multi-characters, I'll have one character in one color sketch, another character in another color sketch, but there's even times like this where different elements of the sketch, you can use different colors in the elements of the sketch, just so you can visually keep track of everything. This is looking largely okay. I feel like some of the volumes might need a little bit of adjusting, but overall, it looks alright. One thing that has jumped out to me is that that little bit of sort of hair that's poking around the side of the face just needs to sit up a little bit higher for balance's sake. I could have gotten away with it being a bit sort of low. I just really wanted it to sit a bit higher, just because the hair on the other side at this angle is level with the nose, and so I wanted that sort of symmetry, not necessarily actual symmetry, but symmetry of elements, so more sort of visual balance across there. It's looking okay. So now you can see I've got my layer and I've lowered the opacity down, and I'm start doing my inking. So for inking, I tend to use the same brush again. So if anyone's curious about my magic brush, what is the source of your power? Obviously, human sacrifice. Second to that, it's just the airbrush, but with the hardness turned off. And then I've got one where I've got the smoothing turned up, because I was just using the airbrush with the hardness turned up, and changing the smoothing was too much work for me, because I am one of the world's laziest human beings. And I made a brush preset so that I wouldn't have to press the button to change that. Which ironically is evidence that there's the one thing I'll always set aside time for and put effort into, which is avoiding effort. And I am aware how insane that is. And so I'm just doing the outline here of the upper eyelash. Now, with the upper eyelash, I won't fill it in. I've got a step in my inking coming up where I add darker sections to parts of the inking to increase the line weight in certain parts. And since that's me sitting there doing extra black on top of the line work, it makes sense that I do it as part of that sort of step and roll that into that step later on, then do it here. I could well, but it's just more efficient, at least with the way I approach it, to have that step be something I do later. Just doing the nose and the other edge of the piercing there. I wasn't actually thinking of doing a piercing on it, but I had a mate in the Discord suggest that it would look nicer with a piercing, and I remembered I had a friend that had all these like really brightly coloured piercings. This is an era thing. I don't think people do that very much anymore. I think they're all sort of stainless steel, but they had all these brightly coloured ones. Like they were brightly coloured. I think it was like a kind of plastic acrylic. They had green ones, you know, purple, lots of fluoro colours. They looked absolutely great. It was really cool. Being the very boring individual I was at the time, I had all mine in silver, which is cool, but it'd be much cooler to be interesting, which is something I learned far too late, because now I'm too old to dress interesting. Alright, and just doing some nice smooth work on line here. You'll notice this part of the process is very, for me, mechanical. All of the steps are sort of laid out for me. I know where my inking is going to go. This is the part of my drawing process where I, will listen to podcasts, or sometimes I'll do my emails. I've got a little sort of voice to text thing I got with the Google, and I use that to do some emailing back and forth. So depending what your step is, one thing that can help with your productivity is if you have trouble approaching certain steps because they're a bit boring, and you need to stim or remain interested. What can really help is, for some steps, putting yourself in an environment where you can get that sort of step done. So for me, yeah, this is prime podcast time. There's Milo Rossi is probably my favourite one. I think that man's responsible for more laundry than Westinghouse. But I'm just doing the line art for the jaw there, for which I'm perpetually displeased. But I feel like I actually got that bit of line art right first go for once. I should give myself some sort of award. And then just doing the hair in here. And this is also a really good chance to fix some of those mistakes of like too much regularity of section size and giving myself some sort of bad rhythm. And now here, I'm erasing a chunk out of it. Now, the reason I wouldn't just do that and leave a gap is that the flow will look so much better coming in and out if you do it as one actual line, just cut a hole in it, than if you do two sections. You will never quite get it just right with the lines flowing from one to the other. And there I realized I'd actually made a little bit of a tangent for myself with the line coming in to that part of the hair where the hair meets the crevice in the horn. So I just sort of avoided that, and hopefully I've been able to obfuscate that little tangent there so that it doesn't disturb the image there. Now, just getting the neck and moving my way down. I'm trying to be remotely methodical with it. Trying to do the collar sort of latch thing correctly. Again, I always get confused with little buckles and bits. I prefer chains. They're very tedious to draw, but they're almost sort of meditative. I quite like them, actually. And then a big sort of bowing thing there with the leathers coming through the little strappy holy bit. That is the technical term, the strappy holy bit. Named for its inventor, John Strappy Holybit. He had a rough time in primary school, let me tell you. Now, I'm just getting the rest of the collar drawn in there. And you can see I'm not just working sort of top to bottom, I'm kind of working back in the frame towards the front of the frame, so that I don't have to sort of go over and delete too much before I redo it. Now I've got them with their singlet coming down, or again, tank top, which I don't know why it's called a tank top. Like, is it based off the sort of fabric you put over top of like a water tank, like a Coolgardie safe? You guys probably don't have Coolgardie safe, do you? There's a fun thing to Google. It's a bush fridge, that is. I'm getting dragged across Central Australia, and the only water we have was in a Coolgardie safe. But it was cold though, less with every passing minute, but it was still lovely and cold. Right, and then just getting the other little hair bauble holder thing there. And then some of these shapes here. I want to try and keep in mind that it's not just going to be sort of coming out. It's going to be coming out and flowing off to the right and coming back up and becoming quite visible. So I want to make sure that I'm not sort of nailing that flow down as it going down too much. I want to have it sort of open to come over to the right. And I'm just doing the mouth. I'm just going to do a little bit of shaping this one. This one's really got to sort of land right. I want to have it sort of more... have more sort of concave shape language to it. I don't want it to look too sort of, you know, rounded and caterpillar-y and cal-artsy. I think that's about right. I think about right. Yeah, that's good. And normally I wouldn't do the black until a later step in the process, but here I just really want to make sure that it's the right shape once that black is in, because this bit is one of the really sort of key focal points. Like if I get the curve on the back of the hand wrong, no one's really going to bat an eye. But if I get this character's, you know, teeth or eyes misaligned, that one can be a bit of a deal breaker. So I'll try not to spend too much effort on everything, but the effort I do spend, I'll try to spend that on the parts that really sort of matter, that are really going to have an impact. And so now I've got their jacket, and I'm just doing the sort of fluffy bits there. Again, this is a good opportunity to test to see whether I've got too much regularity. So you can see those two little bits there that I merged into one medium-sized bits because they were two little bits the same size as the one that had just been. And so this is a good chance to double check myself. This may not be a problem you have, but I naturally will do things to a very mechanical rhythm. And what that means is that if I'm, for instance, drawing stars in the sky, I'll end up spacing them so evenly, I may just as well have drawn the crosses in grid paper. So for me, it takes a lot of conscious effort to do an organic sort of rhythmic shape to something. And so I have to sort of not just do it, but also have a step where I double check myself. And so now we're getting the jacket in here. And getting that shoulder there. I want to get the shape on that one just right. It's not a very detailed section, but the shoulders that pop out of a jacket can be quite attention grabbing. And so just make sure that they read right and the character looks, you know, as good as they're able to with the way I've set them up. Just doing the line down there on the chest, or will be sort of the bit just below the collarbones. And then a bit more of the sort of fluff around the shoulder there from the jacket top. And again, you can see I'm changing some of the elements of the tufts as I go to make sure that they're much more organically rhythmed. Or they have more of an organic rhythm. I'm not sure how to phrase that exactly. And now the outside. The inner edge bits, they're always a bit of a challenge for me. Look, I tend to get away with it by just sort of wiggling it and drawing some lines and hoping for the best. If it doesn't work, look, an image can never be perfect, but it can be finished. And that's the real victory. I think that's one of the big takeaways from university and working on a few professional illustrations, was that there's nothing quite as final as a deadline. So you may be wondering, is it good enough? Is this really, you know, is this the quality that I want? When you've got a deadline, that phrase then becomes, well, this is what I'm handing in. And it can be a little stressful at first, but it does give you a really good sense for necessity, which also sort of puts you in good stead with not just the work you do having to have a deadline, but understanding the value of getting multiple works done. You don't get better from spending forever puddling in a drawing. You get better from getting a bunch of drawings done and then looking at them and getting feedback from them. So that's one of the reasons why I've made these fairly quick draw-alongs, so you can essentially follow the process along, get a bit of muscle memory in getting a drawing done from start to finish, and then get an idea for the kinds of time frames you can get a drawing done in. Now, you may not do this one the same speed as me. You may do it faster, you may do it slower. That's not really sort of where I'm at. So long as you're getting something out the door and you're familiar with the feeling of going from start to finish, that's a big thing I'm after people picking up. And there's a complete process as part of it. So, just doing more of those little fluffy bits there. Quite a lot of fluffy bits there. It'll be fun when I get to the line weighting stage. Now, I was tempted to do a lot more detail on the folds and creases around the arm here, but I decided against it. I was going to initially make it one of those, I think they're puffy or puffer jackets. If I had someone correct me and say it's not puffy jackets, it's puffer jackets. And I'm like, those puffy jackets, yes. Now, I don't want to be a prescriptive grammarian, but I feel like we have adjectives for a reason, but you know. Just doing a bit more of a fold there. I don't want to do too much detail again on the folds in the elbow here as well. Even though that would make it look like that sort of polyester, that shiny sort of polyester thin material you get in those eider-down jackets. So here I'm doing the line of hair, or the top edge of the line of the hair from the ponytail on the right. And you can see I had to sort of add an extra section because I hadn't made it come out sideways enough. And now I'm doing the sections that are coming down between the hands, which can be a little tricky. But I'm trying to get them there and try to mentally keep track of them and not get them too mixed up with the fibrous sort of elements of the fluffy bit there on the edge of the jacket. And so long as I keep the shape language of the jacket fairly distinct from it, I should be okay. So that's the naive line art done. The reason I call it the naive line art is there's two sort of stages when I do line art. There's this and there's the next stage. So what I'm going to do here, I'll get the ink, I'm going to colour it, and then I'm going to go to a new layer. Now the reason I'm going to do that, first I'm going to switch the sketch on and off, just because if I switch the sketch on and off and a part of it disappears and reappears, that means there's a bit I forgot to ink. So that's a little sort of self-check for me to make sure that I haven't forgotten to add something. And now I'm going to colour the line art. I might colour it maybe red. No, I feel like purpley pink. No, it's utterly arbitrary. You can pick whatever you like. And now on a separate layer, I'm going to go over and do the line weighting variation. So this is where I'm going to thicken things where they sort of get close and touch. So essentially simulating ambient occlusion. You don't have to do ambient occlusion. You can do, thicker line art based on the distance between the object. You can do thicker line art based on the primary lighting direction. I was just actually going through, speaking of which, I was just going through John Gerard Mobius's art book, whose name escapes me. And it was really interesting looking at the different things that they'll do line art for. He's got this wonderful sense of implied texture there. I got turned on to his work by one of my uni lecturers, actually. Rubbish lecturer, but fantastic taste in artist. And so here I'm just adding a bit of, you see the little dark bits between the hair there? So as the sort of sections of hair get closer together, less of that ambient light is going to be able to get in there. If you imagine a really, really soft light, like if you had a whole sort of big soft box that was like your whole ceiling, like that scene out of Batman, you'll notice there's no hard shadows anywhere because all the light is coming from all the directions. And so then the shadows become a matter of, is this occluded? You can see there I'm just adding a bit of hair that was supposed to poke out the side, but I forgot it. It's in the sketch, but it didn't make it across, and it's too small to sort of pick up when I did that check where I switched the line art on and off. So this is another good chance to sort of essentially self-check yourself, to self-check your work, and make sure that you don't have any sort of gaps or any sort of missing bits of information or anything you've forgotten. I will still forget things. I have, that is one of my few truly unique talents, is my ability to forget basically anything. Case in point, I had a lovely little sort of heart thing that came off there, and I didn't ink that, and it didn't make it into the final image, but that's what that is. And then just adding a little bit more here. Anywhere where light would be getting occluded, where I have a little dark section, like around the top bit of the ear there, or that little bit where the hair booble gets close to the hair on them, because they do have quite long hair. There as well on the neck, and the detailing section on things like the collar. And just doing a bit more around, just finding those little dark sections, like especially the underside of that would have a fair bit of ambient occlusion. Now doing a little bit in all the little sort of V valleys in the tufty bits. It'll help sort of give it a bit of shape. One good thing about ambient occlusion is it's not direction specific. With directed lighting, it'll tend to, obviously, come from a specific direction, but ambient light comes from everywhere. So even if you haven't decided which direction your primary light source is going to be, your ambient lighting is going to work the same. You'll notice with this, if you've ever watched those visual effects breakdowns, where they'll have the CG character and have the multiple layers of lighting they put together to composite the 3D thing they add in, and one of them is the ambient occlusion layer, because ambient occlusion is universal. So you can light something with ambient occlusion and then add on top of that lighting and shadow from your directed lighting, and it will work just fine. And now a bit more there. Again, this is one of my my prime podcast watching periods. I think Milo Rossi's my current favorite one. I'm trying to think who else is good. Oh, there's Technology Connections, who actually has one of the best art videos I've ever seen. It was on the color brown. I'd link it, but I don't want to brigade. But I'm seeing a bit more of the detail in the arm there. Oh, sorry, around the fluffy bit of the wrist there. And you notice that I don't have a lot of the creases in the center of the palm marked out with line art. Those I'm going to do with areas of tone. So some parts will be marked line art when there's a division between objects, and other parts I'm going to divide the surfaces with areas of tone if I don't feel like there's enough of a division to warrant cutting them apart with line art. And then more just around the sides here. And all those little bits there. It can be a little tedious, and this step is, look, honestly, you could get away with not doing this step. I happen to quite like the impression it gives and how it strengthens the line art, but it is entirely optional. I quite like the look it gives. It's a good chance to catch up on world news. Nothing's been happening lately if you're not caught up. I don't want to ruin it for you, but it's nothing eventful. Don't check the news. And I'm taking a bit more here to the creases around there, just those little dark spots. And the rest of it I'll do with the actual shading, which we'll get to in a minute. We're nearly there. And I'm just closing up any gaps that I've missed, and bits of line art that should have been done but weren't done. And a bit more as we come around. A bit more. And just coming around. Largely done. There's some parts that need to be fixed up. Some parts I've missed as well. Just like with the sketch layer and the ink layer, you can also flick your ink layer, the naive ink, the pink ink. That's a very Dr. Seuss sentence. You can flick that on and off and use that to see where you've got any gaps. In this case, I've noticed that I've missed a bit of the wrist on the left-hand side there. That's looking pretty good. And just doing the ambient occlusion in there for those little bits and bobs. That's looking largely okay. There's really much to do on the chest there, because the chest is covered by the arm in front with their hand there. Their hand there. Something pretty straightforward. I don't think I've missed any other bits. If you're wondering why one of my brushes is a photorealistic drawing of Steve Buscemi, you might have to watch the inking video for that. Looking largely okay. I'm just taking a broad view at it there, and you can see I'm going to flick that on and off to see if there's any sections that I just haven't done. So if I flick that on and off and there's a bunch of bits that didn't disappear and reappear, there's a gap, then that tells me where I may have missed some. That's why I keep them on separate layers, just for self-checking. Again, you may have a higher level of competence and ability to remember things. That's looking pretty good. So now that I've got them right, I'll merge them together, and then I'll just lower the brightness on it. So go Control U on the keyboard for brightness, hue, and saturation, and then just lower the brightness once they're merged and make them into black ink. And now make a layer underneath the ink layer and call that one Flats, or you can call it Steve if you want. But just call it something, so you don't end up with, you know, a finished image that has all your layers called something like layer 14, layer 15, layer 16. If you're feeling called out by this, it's because I'm one of them. Now I've got my flat selected, and so now I'm going to sort of dump in my base colors. So these aren't necessarily going to be the starting colors. I'm going to use these colors as the base ones, and then I'm going to go over them with other colors. Why I'm still going to do big solid colors first is because I'm going to use my flats layer as a selections layer. So you can see there's a little lighthouse icon there in the layers tab. It's right next to the group clip to previous layer. What that does is that'll nominate that layer as a reference layer. So if you're using then the magic wand tool or the bucket tool, you can tell it to, instead of looking at what's on the page or what's on the layer you've got selected, it'll look at that one reference layer to base its selections off of. So you can essentially have your flats on one layer and then set that as your reference layer, and then whenever you want to make selections, it'll make selections based on those flat colors, and you can just grab the skin, grab the hair, grab the jacket, whatever, all at once without having to individually select sections. It's a really great way of saving some time, just having all your flat colors on one layer. And so here I'm just doing a bit of skin layer around the eye there, because, you know, the machine doesn't know to stop filling where the white of the eye is. It just keeps on going. And just throwing down more skin tone. It's looking fairly good. Again, none of these colors have to be final. I can just select that color range and do a hue and saturation adjustment. And now I'm trying to find just the right sort of pinks and cyans for the jacket and accessories and so forth. Because I want that sort of rainbow plus sort of vaporwave color set, like the old sort of cyan and pink. And where possible, I'm going to reuse the colors. So I want to have a colorful image, but one thing that helps with image cohesion is reusing the same colors. Like if you imagine the red Power Ranger, you'd have, you know, one red for the helmet, a different red for the gloves, a different red for the chest. It just wouldn't work. Whereas that unity of colors can really help. So that's one of the real sort of benefits behind unity and togetherness of color. It can really help. I'm doing sort of pale cyan there. It might be a bit too saturated. That's okay. I can just sort of tune it later. And then a dull sort of metal color for things like the lock and the latch on the collar. Now, one of the other things I'm going to do is I'm going to do some white for things like the fur trim collars and so forth. Even though the image is white, I'm going to make them white as well, because I want to use that color selection to change them and also inform the shading. A bit more. Right now I've turned the white of the paper off, and that'll let me see where I've actually not done white. One of the things with like filling with white is that if you're filling white over white, it's hard to see where you've missed. So that's one of the points behind that sort of checkerboard pattern. You can turn off your paper and then make sure that you've actually filled in white where you want to. It does still mean you have to do a little bit of a check though. Like for instance, if you have a very small gap in your flats and it's a gap of white over one of the white parts of the checkerboard, it won't show up. And so now I'm just going to fill in some of the gaps there. Now there's a tool that's meant to be for adjusting your line weighting. I actually find it's really helpful for adjusting your fills. You can essentially have it bleed the color out. Like if I put it all the way out, you can see it takes the fills past the line art. But if I pull that back in, I can have it get as wide as possible without actually leaving the line art behind. And that'll actually fill in most of those little white gaps or little sort of white leftovery bits. Not all of them, but some of them. That largely done. I've got most of the regions coloured in. I'm just going over and checking any bits that I've missed. There may still be, one or two little bits that I've missed as we go, and that's fine. You can always sort of come back in later and make changes. Nothing is irrevocable. Life's all about change. It's looking largely okay. Make a new layer now, and I'm going to call this one my color variation. So essentially what this is going to be is it'll be clipped, well, it'll be based on the shape of the flats, and it's going to add a lot of color variance. So I'm going to do the multicolored hair on this layer. I'll call that layer Rainbowify. And so now I've got my flats layer. You can see I've selected that reference layer button. And so now the flats is a reference layer. So now when I have my magic wand tool, and I'll select my soft airbrush. I'll see if I can get a secondary color going. I'll try and do the horn here. Now what I don't realize at this point is I'm actually doing this on my flats layer and I have to redo it in about 10-15 seconds. So bear with me while we both watch me make this mistake. There's me adding the orange on the flats layer. Wonderful. I was thinking of editing this out, but I feel like I should include a lot of the mistakes so I don't sort of movie magic too many of my challenges away. And then going grading from purple to orange to yellow. If I go straight from purple to yellow, I'll get a bit of a sort of a dull, muddy color in between. So having that actual orange in between the two really helps that transition. And then back a bit more. Zoom out. Looks good. I like the gradient. And now I think around about now I'm going to realize that it's on the wrong layer. Whoopsie doopsie. No, not now. Okay. Still holding on. And so I'm going to do a bit of color variation on the eye here as well. And so going for an adjacent color. That's one of the things, if you try to sort of go from a color on one side of the color wheel to a color on the other side of the color wheel, you'll find yourself having a sort of really muddy in-between color. So here's me checking to see, yep, it is indeed on the flats layer. Whoopsie doopsie, Control Z all the way. And let's have another go. Just getting that off there. Lovely. All right. But one thing you'll notice is the second time around, it is much, much faster. So now, I know what colors I'm going for. So that darker purple to start off with. It can be a bit sort of tricky transitioning from one color to another. So it's important to sort of make sure you're going from one relatively adjacent color on the color wheel to another. There's a lot of sort of pitfalls, like what kind of brush you use as well. Like if you use a stiff edged brush, that can make it more challenging, or if you're using the pen tool, you just straight up can't do it with the pen tool. You could say, transitioning from one color to another, it can be a bit of a trap. But we're not going to say trap anymore because it's unhelpful and it's not very nice. So instead, what we're going to focus on is, making transitions like this easier for everyone. And so we're going to use the soft airbrush for it. So you can see here, going from sort of red through to yellow works really well. And you can see the soft airbrush is just perfect for this. Now, the soft airbrush isn't for everything, but having the right resources to help with transition like this, it is critical. And having these tools and information available for people who need it really is important. That's why I've made these videos on brush tools. And so now I'm sort of trying to do a bit of a cool green coming up into the yellow there. Might be too much of a difference. I might have to go for a bit of a sort of, maybe a bit of a warmer green first, but we'll see how we do. What I might also do is just use the lasso tool to sort of section off parts of it so I can have those gentle gradients, but have them affect slightly differently. So if I do the gentle gradient coming up here, which I realize I've sort of picked up a bit of the hair I didn't want to there. I was picking up that bit close to the lock of hair above the eye. So now I've got that bit sort of sectioned out. So my selection is just that little sort of side bang. So are the side bits called bangs? I don't know if they're called bangs. And so I'm just going to have that come up there. I want to leave a little bit of the yellow in it just so it doesn't have too much of an abrupt transition between that sort of that aquary teal color and the orangey red of the hair. And so I've got the selection up there. And now what I'm going to do is go to a straight sort of teal and brush just a bit of that in on the edge there. And you can see I'm going from one color to another. I'm traveling around the color wheel. I'm not making too many big jumps. If you make too many big jumps in saturated colors, you're going to get this really muddy area between them, and it's going to be bad. You're not going to have a good time. And so now I'm doing a bit of the hair at the back there. And so you can see again, I'm going from that to a color that's fairly close to the yellow. And then just making some of these patterns with the lasso tool, because I want some very, very gentle sort of sections with one color to another. If you can imagine, the sort of hair has been tied up and some locks are sitting slightly higher than others when they've tied back their hair. And so I'm just going to put a bit more of that sort of greeny color there, just because going straight from the yellow to the cyan was a bit much. And then doing a bit more green down towards the bottom there, and then picking up a bit of cyan again at the very bottom. That's looking okay. And now that bit of the hair that I sort of sequestered off, I'll just redo that with line art there. So firstly I'll select the hair, and then I'll cut this section out. Instead of trying to make a selection, I'll just cut out the section I don't want. Bit of yellow there. A bit at the top. And then making another selection here for that sort of lock there. Making a bit of a lighter, slightly lighter band. I don't want it a lot lighter, I want it just a little bit. I want to, with just a gentle bit of colour and the sort of inherent lighter tone, I want to just separate this from the rest of the hair on the head. Now I'm making a little strip selection. One thing you'll notice is that the lasso tool and the soft airbrush together can actually make a lot of really useful stuff. Normally you wouldn't shade or do actual tone work with the soft airbrush, but the soft airbrush definitely has a place for things like effects or when used with the lasso tool. And so I've deselected all the hair on the head there. I'm just going to do this at ponytail, so a bit of a time. So you can see as I'm going around that color wheel, I'm sort of skipping ahead to purple. I've gone to sort of cyan, and I should have gone to blue next, but I've sort of jumped ahead to purple because I wanted to. And I'm going back the other way a bit. It's going to a sort of cyan color. I'm just going to deselect this section here. And now I've got the lasso tool so I can make a bit of an edge there. The reason I've got those edges going on there is I want to have the back part of the hair look like it's made of layers of different colors sort of coming together. Then I made another selection, and we go over with another color with a big soft airbrush. We'll need to change the color a bit. It might have been a bit too much of a jump, but since I don't have any sort of transitional area between the two colors, I can just get away with the color contrast and have that work. And then grab a little bit of the high vibrance yellow as well. That's looking okay. And now there's another little bit of selection there. Now, I've got that selection. I'll just redo that one. I sort of dropped that one a bit sort of sharply there. Now let's grab this area here. So I'm using the lasso to grab essentially sort of regions or sort of chunks of hair. One of the things you'll notice is you can do hair in lots of pieces. Now, hair is made of, millions of tiny individual long strands and fibers. But when we draw them, we tend to group them together into these sort of clumps, these sort of lumps of hair. And you can do that with things like line art, but you can also do that with regions of tone, or in this case, regions of color. So I've got the line art there you can see coming in from the left that's continuing in as an edge of difference in color between the sort of yellow and the orange there as it transitions from one to the other. And you'll also notice that I don't have to worry about the colors being too far on the color wheel and producing a muddy mix since I'm not mixing them. I'm going with a hard cutoff between things like the yellow and the cyan, or the blue cyan. If I were to blend those two colors, that would look just hideous. And there I've got a little bit of green coming in as well. But the green will mix with the yellow quite well, so I can actually sort of gradient that in. And then just grabbing another piece here. I want to have the ponytail look like it's a lot of, or the pigtail, is a pigtail a ponytail? Either way. Look like it's a sort of a gathering together of these different parts of the hair. And that's going to give it a sort of a different sort of chunks of color on different parts of it. And now I'll move on to coloring the hair on the right side. I was actually half considering leaving it with a sort of one big color there to sort of contrast it against the horn, but I decided that since it's focal point and a lot of this image is all about having this character, with lots of bright colors and lots of interesting bits of vibrance and hue change, that I'd take that opportunity to do it there as well. And so here I've got a base bit from the red to the purple. Again, I'm making sure that when I'm transitioning to the color that's nearest to it on the color wheel, or at least fairly close. And there, I just did a little bit on that frond on the right. It's not very noticeable, but it does kind of separate it. Like if you didn't have the color blend very well, it would have a hard edge, and that hard edge would separate it. In this case, I'm going for that. So if you think of the times when your blending hasn't quite worked right, this is like that, but on purpose. And so now I've got that selection area there, and I'm just going to cut that section to the left of it out, so I can have a bit of the blue come up there. Or more cyan, sort of more than cyan than blue. And then the same thing here, I'm going to use the existing sort of shape. You can see there's the feathering of the hair as it comes down there next to the face. And it's sort of implied that the feathering keeps going past where the line art is. And so I'm going to use that and make a selection, or deselect part of it rather, and have that be a different color. So now, I'll just flip and invert my selection, and then just take other parts of it out. So the things like the magic wand are really great when used together with a reference layer. You can click on certain parts of an image and it'll make selections based on the reference layer. But you can also alt-click to deselect regions based on that. So you can select everything and go, I want everything except for the hair and skin. Or I want everything that I've got now, but take away this. And so it's a great way of controlling what you've got selected. For any of you who've used like wet media, it's essentially like a much smarter version of masking fluid. And it smells much nicer as well. I actually dug out my masking fluid recently after not using it for about 10 years, and I was expecting to get a jar of solidified silicone, and no, it still worked just fine. I think it seals itself very well around the cap, so I mean the paints had all turned to little rocks, but that one would work quite well. I guess that's me shadow dropping that I'll be making a traditional media video at some point in the relatively near future. And so now I'm going to color the rest of the ponytail there in that sort of cyan color, and that'll let me have a progression as I go from, like you can see at the top of the head, from the red to the purple to the cyan and then to the blue as I go in. But I'm going to have that progression kind of broken up. And so here I'm going to try and drop a bit of an adjacent sort of cool green. That said, I could have probably gotten away with a very warm sort of verdant green there. I do like using verdant green, almost as much as I like saying verdant green. Verdant green is just fun to say. And then I can go from the sort of cyan color to a sort of bluey purple. And then I can go from that to a yellow. That one, I really wanted to go to yellow. And you can see there, that's that thing I've been sort of warning about. That transition between the blue and the yellow is a bit muddy. But it works okay, and that muddiness behind the hands there, I can actually use that in my favor, because that'll let me have a lower sort of saturation point that'll help give some contrast to the saturation in the gloves. So I decided I'd give it a red hot go to see if I can use that gradient as a way of dulling the contrast there. Now here I'm just sort of thinking about having the fur trim and the singlet be different colors, or different kinds of very pale color. Just because I want the sort of the body of the character, though not much of them is visible, I want to have it sort of communicate, you know, the shape in contrast then to the puffy shape of the jacket. And now here where I've turned off that white layer in the background, you can see there's a few bits that I've actually left a gap with that I didn't notice on my flats. You're just getting an eye on it, just zooming, leaving it zoomed out so I can get a view to any bits that I've missed. I feel like I've got most of them. And so here, I'm making a new layer. And I'm going to call this one Tone Variance. So what this is essentially the same as the one I've got on top to do the hair coloring. I'll do the same thing and do it relative to the skin tone, just to add a bit of variation to the color of the skin tone. You can add like greens and other colors as well. The color zones of the face are really interesting if you're doing sort of more realistic or traditional painting. With this one, I'm just simplifying it down to adding a bit of redness variation wherever bone or cartilage comes close to the surface. So you can see like where the cheekbone comes close to the cheeks there on the character. I'll do a bit of redness there. I'll do a bit on the bridge of the nose, a bit on the tips of the ears, and then on the shoulders and maybe the collarbones as well. That's looking okay. I'm just going to make sure I don't go too heavy with it. When you're doing the sort of the color variation, make sure you either use a very, very low density brush, or you lower the opacity of the layer quite a lot, because it can be very overpowering if you let it go too far. Again, there's another instance where the soft airbrush has a role. Soft airbrush shouldn't be used for shading, but it should definitely be used for effects, because that's where it shines. Now here, you can see I'm going to start on the shading. So I've got a new layer sitting above all my various color ones, and already you can see the colors looking a bit dull where I've done the shading. Don't worry, that will get fixed later. For now, I'm using a fairly pale, fairly desaturated sort of pinkish color to do the shading. I'm going to mark out where I want the shading to be, and I'll actually do a bit of a trick with the shading where I make the shading a lot smarter. So when you're shading, ideally you should shade not with one single color, but with a slightly darker and hue shifted version of whatever color you're shading over the top of. Now you could do that by color picking the color you're shading over and then manually adjusting it, but there is a smarter way to do that, and we will get to that in a bit. But for now, I'm just marking out where I want the shading to be, and then I'll fix up the shading's color later. Because remember, this is digital, we have all the cool buttons and switches. Now the other thing you can probably see is that I'm doing my shading with the same brush I did my sketching with, which is the same brush that I did my line art with. There are very few situations where you need a special brush for things. While I don't recommend things like a hard pen tool for sketching, because it makes it hard to see where you've built up as opposed to where the brush has just been, there is still a lot of sort of room for using, you know, some very situational brushes in some cases, but for the most part, your brush is just the way you express your understanding of the figure or of the subject. And if you're having trouble with it, I've very seldom come across, well, no, I'll frame it another way. I have come across, you know, since I've been an art teacher for a minute or two, quite a number of situations where people have a skill issue that needs to be resolved by adding a skill to their current skill set. Very rarely have I come across a situation where someone has a brush issue as opposed to a skill issue. Now, a skill issue can be used in a very derogative way, so I don't want to sort of imply that if you're having trouble, it's because you've some sort of personal failing, but it is something where you're quite likely, when you're closer to starting out, and I'm speaking from personal experience here, that you want to do things the way the artists you're looking at do them. And so since you don't really know which bits are the magic bits, you kind of copy everything. The example I always give is that when I was in primary school, there was a kid named Mitchell. And he was as terrible a student as I was. He was as badly behaved as I was, threw things, the whole kit. And he never got in trouble. Now, I couldn't quite figure out why. So, I figured it was one of a few things. Either it was the way he drew the capital M. He did the dip in the middle of the M quite high up. The way he drew the number 2, he had a loop at the bottom instead of a corner. The way he spoke and behaved. Or the way he would use the ink refill on the desk. Now, I copied all of them. And of course, you know, it worked. And I still do the 2 and everything else to this day. But I wasn't able to sort of see the significance of which one was the important one. And so when you're starting out, you'll start copying, well, what brush is, you know, magical artist number 2 using? And so you'll use that brush, and it won't do anything. And the thing you've got to remember is that it's hard to know what you don't know when you start out, but unless you're using a tool that is actively working against you, using a particular magic, shading, whatever brush is not a thing. So I'm purposefully, in all my videos, using very, very standard default tools. And so here you can see with the shading, I'm just putting blobs in and cutting them out. And I'm putting blobs in and cutting them out. The magic is coming from my understanding of this figure as three-dimensional volumes. Now I've got my video on shading and lighting, which is how you decide where to put this shading. And then how you put the shading is you just blob it in and maybe cut it out. The reason why blobbing it in and cutting it out can work a lot better than just using a smaller brush to pencil some in is that you can often find yourself becoming less brave when you're using a smaller brush. It's easy to make smaller incremental areas of shadow and shade than it is to make larger ones. And so since hesitancy is one of the things you really got to get over when you start out, anything that makes it easier to be more hesitant is something that will slow you down. So I always recommend using a large brush and a large eraser and working on doing larger areas of tone rather than smaller detail bits of tone. I say that as we both watch, a video of me doing smaller detailed areas of tone. But the idea is sound, hopefully. And you can see here the shading there is not strong enough yet, and don't worry about that. We're going to fix that later when I make the shading smarter. And so now I've got my selection, and I've selected the hairbands and the collar and the gloves because they're all the same pink. And that's a great way to sort of have more color cohesion. And of course the little nose septum piercing. Is it septum? Or is that it's like a Harry Potter spell or something? No, whatever. Now I'm also going to give a bit more red to the hair baubles there, just because the pink was not quite separating it from the hair enough there. So a darker red will work a bit better. And it'll also give me a chance to make it a very different material. So where the hair is shiny and fibrous, I'm going to make the hair baubles very smooth and rounded and glossy. The hair will still be glossy, but I want that sort of difference there. And so now I'm dropping a bit of shading on the eye. And I don't have to worry too much about this one. I do a very old school sort of way of doing the shading in the eye. It's based off the old Neon Genesis Evangelion one, where they've got the sort of the two lines down from the side. Now I've realized just here that I've used the red that I was using to correct the baubles with. If you find you're sort of shaded with a color that isn't what you're after and you don't want to go over it, what you can do is you can set the layer and lock the transparency in the layer. What it basically means is you can draw over the layer, but you can only draw over where you've already drawn. And so here I just lock the layer and then drew over the eyes with the original shading color, and that way I didn't add any more pixels, it just changed the color and whatever of what was on that layer as it was. And then of course remember to turn that off and then get back into doing the shading. And so I'm doing their earrings there, just a little sort of the colored sort of acrylic studs, and then just some very simple bits of shading on the collar on the neck there. Again, I'm not going to do too much detail because a lot of this will just be sort of shaded straight out with the drop shadow from the chin. Drop shadows, and if you watch any of these, you've probably heard me extol the great and glorious benefits of drop shadows, but just to do it again. So drop shadows are probably your best ratio of effort to having your image look good that you get a chance to do, just because they give you immediate depth and they establish things in 3D so much better than individually shading each part. Having a whole region be blacked out with shadow, like a big cast shadow, really sets the tone and the shape and the volumes really well, whereas your detail shading is great for giving subtlety to those forms, but if you haven't established those larger forms very well yet, then that's going to be a missed opportunity. So take the chance whenever you can to drop big cast shadows, as big as you can sort of get away with, because they'll really sort of help separate planes, and they'll really sort of help give a thing depth. So I'm just dropping a little bit of those aforementioned shadows there on the face from the hair. I don't want to do too much sort of subtle shading on this one, just because I want a sort of more simple shaded, more planar image, but having a little bit around some of the focal areas and giving that some detail there is, tends to be a good idea. And so I'm just getting this curve here. I just want a little tiny smidge of tone along that cheek. So I've rotated the image because it's much easier to do that curve when, like I keep saying, it lines up with the natural arc of movement of the wrist. And then a bit under the arm there, just for the pinch of where the pectoral folds in under the arm. And then doing some implied shape for the collarbone here. So I'll do a blob in and then cut some out, which is a much easier way of getting that shape right, rather than having a really small brush and trying to sort of wheedle that little line in. Just get a really big brush, blob it in, and then cut the sides in until you get the thickness you're after. And then a bit of drop shadow from the collar there. I think that'll sort of work. And again, here I'm doing just some flat shading there between that sort of center line of the chest. And then I'm just going to cut with a hard eraser, which I should also point out, my eraser for most of this is my brush again. You can use, I think it's C on the keyboard, or if you're in, I forget what the Paint Tool side version is, but you can press C on the keyboard to change the brush you're using to be an eraser. The reason this can be a lot better than using the actual eraser in a lot of circumstances is that if you're working with small details, you'll naturally want to erase small details. So pressing C will turn your brush into an eraser. If you're working with hard line art or hard areas with no soft edge, then your hard-edged pen would make the perfect hard-edged eraser. And so it's basically having your brush be a context-relevant eraser, which is really valuable depending on what you're drawing. And that said, of course, having your actual eraser set up to be larger can also be valuable. That's why it's worth having both those tools and presets. I guess the only downside to it is I keep accidentally leaving myself on the brush as eraser when I go to start brushing things, and for some reason paint doesn't come out. But that's a known issue. And so I'm just doing very, very light removal of some of that tone there, just so I can better shape the pinch under the arm there of the chest. And then I've got the eye selected. I'm just going to do a bit of a drop shadow of the eyelashes. And now I've got the shoulder here. I'm sort of shading that in. I've got a lot of detail in the shape of these areas here, so I don't want to have too much detail in the actual shading. And so you can see there I'm doing these nice fine little lines and fine little points with a big round brush by just brushing, erasing to make that sort of jagged pattern. And here I'm just making a little bit and just doing the reverse, where I'll erase it out and then brush it in to make a little sharp edge of a little errant, little tufty bit of fur that's coming out there. Or fluff, I'm sure. Do you still call it fur when it's fur trim? Yeah, it's fur. And then a little fold over here. And again, I don't have to do very much. I just have to do a couple of bits to imply that that sort of detail is there. It's looking okay, so I can move now over to some of the rest of it. This is one of the other benefits to having a reference layer with your flats on it that you use then to make your selection of where to shade and shine. You are probably not as forgetful as me. I just as a blanket statement, that's objectively probably true. So one of the reasons this works really well for me is that it sort of segments my work, where I'm doing the shading on the blue of the jacket, I'm doing the shading on the green of the hair. And having to go through these different sections step by step makes me less likely to miss and forget parts of the image. So here you can see that having that has meant I've been doing just little bits of fur trim. That's kept me in the same sort of mode, the same sort of practice, the same sort of brushes and tools, And so for me, it works out as a really good way of saving time and building efficiency by putting myself in and keeping myself in a particular mode and region in a way that also prevents me from missing bits. So I'll do all these, I'll look over where it's selected, the running ants will draw the eye to where I need to work, and then I'll move on to the next bit. And so you can see here I'm just doing a big blob, and then I'm just cutting it out where I want to have a sharp pointy bit, and zooming more. I've got to probably do a better job of fighting my inorganic rhythm that you'll see me do. And just filling that in. Probably should have made the brush bigger, but you know, here we are. And those shapes are looking okay. And there you can see I'm coming back in and just giving it a bit of a more organic sort of rhythm to it, and just changing and mixing up some of those piece sizes so they're not so repetitive. Now here I'm going to go on their shirt. I'm wanting to make the selection there, but the color is still white. It's only pink because I've got that overlay color. So I'm going to have to manually deselect out this. I probably should have just colored the cuffs on the actual flats layer, but that's probably a planning thing on my part. And so here I'm just going to do a very, very simple bit of shading. I just want to imply that there's that sort of crease you get with the rib cage. So when you lean back, that the rib cage has that sort of dip upwards shape in the middle towards the front. And so as the flesh pulls, it pulls down more in the middle. And so that's why you'll get that sort of divot, that sort of valley and crevice that runs down the center line of the body. And so I'm having the shirt sort of follow that line as it goes past the rib cage point there. So now I'm just deselecting more of the fluffy fur trim bit there, so I can then shade more of the singlet. And so one of the things I want to do with the singlet is these little sort of creases towards the very edge there where the seam is, where the stitching goes. You can do that with line art and it will look fine, but sometimes line art can be a bit overpowering, where you don't want to sort of communicate a very hard division, like a fold over. You just want to communicate that there is a darker section there. So a bit of shading as a sort of detail in place of line art can go a long way, because it's a bit softer. It's not too hard. It doesn't demand that attention. It doesn't have that sort of hard detail, and lets you blend it then, like this, into the natural sort of folds and shadows of the singlet itself, or whatever garment you're drawing. So I'll have the creases then coming from where the seam is and sort of expanding out. A bit more there, and just not going too hard on this. Oh, the other thing I'll notice with this is that where the shading isn't strong enough on things like parts of the hair, the shading here on the white shirt is much too strong. And that's another thing that the making the shading smarter is all about. The color and value of the shading really needs to change with what it's going over the top of. And so the white is a great example of where it needs to be paler, but going over and doing it in a more pale color can be kind of a pain. Here I'm just going over the shading on the jacket, and this is another thing we can see the issues of just multiply shading, is you've got a color that's relatively distant on the color wheel, and the color it's putting down it's better than shading with black. Obviously, everything's better. Never shade with black. That's a cardinal sin. But shading with a multiply layer color that is too distant from the color you're shading over will give you a level of sort of dull muddiness that is almost as bad as shading with black. But again, it doesn't have to be. We can still use this layer and make it smarter a little down the line. So just bear with us for that. For now, we're just marking out where we want it to be darker. We'll fix the amounts later. I'm just trying to be really sparing with this. I don't want to pull too much sort of detail here. I want some big, broad, flat kind of rest areas. Otherwise, it'll just be like hard detail on the shoulder, hard detail on the arm, hard detail on the wrist, the hands are going to be the hardest detail of all. So I just want to make sure there's some rest area there, where it's not too heavy all the way. A bit more around the arm there, that's good. And just learning to stop is another thing. I could probably sit there all day and do creases and detail, but I need to not do it and just sort of trust the viewer to know that I've showed a few folds and they know it's a jacket, they know how jackets work, they know how jackets fold. Give them enough to be starting off with and trust your audience to fill in the blanks. Implied detail is actually the best detail for two reasons. One, it's the easiest because you don't have to draw it. But two, it looks perfect because detail you imply is detail that happens within the mind of the viewer. So if you have detail that you describe, it looks as good as you have described it. But detail that you allude to, detail that you imply, is perfect. If you imagine a photo of an apple, you can picture in your mind what the back of the apple looks like. Now that's implied detail. You can't see the back of the apple. That information is not present in the media you're seeing. But your view of the back of the apple, your expectation of it, is perfect. And so that's one of the benefits of implied detail. If you get the viewer to assume the role of essentially artist, they will draw it exactly as they expect it. And normally when you draw something, it will look different from their expectation. If I draw a depiction of a character from a book based on what I feel they look like, that will be my interpretive view. And the same thing's true to some extent with everything you draw, where your interpretation of how a thing should or could look is going to be different from everyone else's, but that's where the benefits of implied detail come in. Implied detail has a perfect resonance with their expectations, which means it will always look right. It will always look literally perfect. And so here, just doing a bit more, just doing a big drop shadow there. Big drop shadows. Always take the opportunity where you can. You can see I've dropped one on the wrist of the character on the left, or from our point of view, the wrist on the left. And so from there, it'll be their right, my left, but it's all relative. And so here I've got my brush and I've just turned it into an eraser. Just pull up a little bit of reflected light, or alluding to reflected light. I won't do like a layer of screen to sort of actually have a lit from below, but I will just shear off a little bit of my shading layer. And so here I'm going to do the gloves. Now, I want the gloves to be glossy and shiny. Now, the thing about gloss and shine is it means that it works more like a mirror than a matte object. If you imagine that you have a mirror in front of you, and you put a little shelf over the top of the mirror, your reflection in the mirror looks fine. If you had done that to a matte sheet of, a green painted board, it would now be in shadow. It would change how it looks. But since a mirror is a reflection of what's in front of it, unless you shade yourself, your reflection won't look different. You can't shade a mirror. The same thing is very much true for glossy objects. They, instead of having a sort of a mapped shading and lighting setup like every other object, they'll actually tend to have a mapped projection of what's in front of them, albeit simplified, sort of wrapped onto the surface. A lot of old video games used to have easy use. If you think of like Metal Mario, that was just an image wrapped around the polygons, but the image direction didn't change. And so as the character moved and changed, the image reflected would still point towards the viewer, which is where it gave that sort of metallic effect from. And so the same thing's true here. You can see I've got the character being lit above and from the left, but I've got my shading on the hand above and to the left as well, which is antithetical to where I've got on the rest of the image. But for me, that's where my shading map is going to have its darkest section, because this is a simplified reflection of the view in front of the subject. Now, if you are interested in like reflections, shines, and reflection mapping, I do have a video explaining that process. I'll put a link to that here. Unless I've run out of links. YouTube only lets you do so many links, so we'll see how I do. And so here I'm doing a bit of the creases in the fabric, or the stitching marks, where they would be. So these aren't necessarily shadows, but if you imagine that reflection, if you curve, or if you have a mirror that's sort of flexible and you curve it, you'll notice that towards the edges of the curve, the details get compressed and compressed and compressed, which means you end up with higher and lower, so you end up with sort of higher bands of contrast towards those edges. And so here, to simulate that, I'm having the lines of stitching create bands of shading or bands of lighting. And I guess where I run into a challenge with this is when doing a reflection, you've got to have the reflection be consistent. So if you imagine you have a set of chrome grapes. I keep using this as an example. I saw them at Kmart. It was the most... It's like a plaster casted set of grapes that have been painted in sort of chrome, and I thought, that's lovely. I can't wait for that to be landfill in less than 6 months. But one of the things that was really interesting about it is I noticed my reflection was obviously the same in each of the chrome spheres, because it's based on the direction of the surface and which way it's facing, rather than any other sort of lighting. So I've got to remember here that anything that's facing towards the left side of an object will reflect whatever's on the left side of the subject. So it will be, in this case, a darker region. And then anything that is sort of front-facing will be paler. And then anything that is towards the right side will also be pale as well. So trying to remember those contours of things like the bulges of the hand, and then apply to them, based on the direction they are facing, how that reflection would apply. One thing you can do to help scaffold this for yourself is you can make a little sort of sphere next to what you're drawing with, and you can map out your reflection on that sphere and then reference that. So when you need, well, this surface is facing down to the left. If I look at my reference sphere, down and to the left is this part of the reflection. And so here you can see I've tried to, where the surfaces are facing to the left, I'll shade them. And where the surfaces are front facing or facing to the right, I will try to leave them pale. Now, you've got a lot of wiggle room with like what you'll get away with, but the other thing to keep in mind is that those reflections will become more complex and harder to track in the folded sections. And that's not a bad thing, that's a good thing. Because if it becomes harder to track, you can just add stuff into the folded sections. I mean, if you can't figure out what looks right and wrong, then the viewer's not going to either. So it's actually a bit where you can get away with basically anything. It's just those big regions you've got to pay a lot of attention to. When you get into those detail sections, as long as you add regions of light and shadow, you'll be fine. And so here I'm just trying to get that bulge of the pad on the outside edge of the hand. Like you've got the pad next to beneath the thumb, but you also got the pad there on that outside edge. And so here I'm realizing I didn't actually do the shading on the fluffy wrist on the right hand side. So I'm just popping that in now. And also I'd missed that sort of wrist under the hand on the left there. It's all looking fairly good. I don't think I missed anything else there. And doing a bit of that shading under the eyelash there. That's looking okay. And then maybe a little bit just in the middle of the teeth there, just to imply that sort of split without having to use line art to overly describe it. Teeth will look kind of weird if you give them too much detail, like individual teeth and gums will always look creepy as heck. Alright, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to make that shading layer smart. So first, I'm going to duplicate my flats. Now since this has a lot of color adjustment on top, I'm also going to duplicate my color adjustment layer. I'm going to merge those together to make essentially what my flats look like. So I've got that layer on top of my flats that has the variations in color of things like the skin and hair. Now I'm going to lower the hue by about 20, like 15 to 20, and then the luminosity by about 10 to 15 as well. This will vary image by image, but for me, minus 15 and minus 20 are usually the ranges that work quite well. So I've got my unified copy of my flats. I've got that sitting above my shading layer, like that. And now I'll clip it to that layer. And you can see immediately that it starts picking up color from the layer it's on top of. And so now I can just do some adjustment, like I can lower the opacity of that color controlling layer. And that'll have more or less of that flats color come through in what I'm shading. So it's essentially as though this entire time I have actually been shading with a darker and hue adjusted form of that color. And I can just adjust it more and more as time goes on. I can grab individual regions of it. So there I've just grabbed the jacket and done a hue and saturation adjustment of the shading there, just to get that a little bluer. This smart shading thing will essentially get you 90% of the way there. Now, if you're working on a webcomic, and 90% is good enough, then this will get you to the finish line. If you're wanting to, have something that looks like, like a final work, or you're handing it in for a client you really want to impress, then it'd be worth, taking that extra 10% manually, but this is a great way to get you close to the line. And so here I've got a new layer on top, and I've made a mask, you can see there. So I did a selection based on the ink and the flats, and then I made that into a mask. So that way I don't have to worry about sort of shading in and out of the lines. I can just shade wherever I want. And so now I'm just going to drop some highlights on this. Normally I wouldn't go this ham on the highlights, but I want this to be a very, very impactful, very out there image. I want it to really sort of, really pop, really land. And so I'm just putting more bits of white in, so big areas of white, and then cutting them out. It's much easier than sort of drawing sort of narrow bits of detail in and try to fill them in. You're better off with larger areas and then cutting them out, just because it helps you be brave. And we all do need to be brave and sometimes fierce. And so I'm just putting a bit more there in the hair, just making them into smoother sort of shapes. And I'll lower the opacity on these as well later. Again, I don't have to worry about getting the opacity and color right from the get-go. I just want to get the regions right first, and then I can make my adjustments. For now, I just want to make sure I've got the shines in the right spots, in the right kind of shapes. I'm doing some on the horn there, and along that sort of top edge of the horn there. And I might even put my shine layer above my line art layer. This isn't an all the time thing, but it can be a great way of giving you a sort of thick paint look to what you're working on. Doesn't always work, but yeah, try it and see. I've been doing it a bit lately and it's been working quite well. It's also another great reason why it's good to work on a clipped layer like this one. Or not clipped layer, sorry, a layer with a mask already set up, where I made a selection based on the flats and the ink combined together, and then use that selection to generate an alpha mask on that highlights layer. And it means I just shade wherever I want, or in this case, put highlights wherever I want, and it'll stay inside the lines. And so I'm just trying a little bit more detail here, so cutting bits out and adding bits in, just to make those bits of detail on the horn really fine and sharp. I want it to look like there's a lot of sort of detail on that, and it's a focal point of the image, so it deserves to have a lot of really fine detail. It's important to sort of plan your image and where you want your detail to be based on where you want the focus to be. If you have lots and lots of hard detail and hard contrast, that will draw the eye. If you have very little, that will be a rest area and it'll help balance out the image. One of the things I see a lot of is people will use, for instance, coming back to as well, the special brushes, they'll use like a special brush for trees and a special grass brush and a special whatever brush. They'll have the problem that they'll have a lot of sharp edges and detail to them that will then demand the attention of the viewer, and it'll pull focus away from the focal point in your image. So it's worth just investing in no brush whatsoever for your backgrounds or your deprioritized elements, because if you have too much sharp detail and contrast in them, the eye of the viewer will be drawn away from your focal points towards these areas of detail that just happen as a result of, repeating patterns, or maybe you're having like a brick pattern that comes with Clip Studio. It demands attention because of its regularity, contrast, and detail. You can combat that a bit as well by, for instance, blurring a background. Even then, the fact that there's an implication of a hard bit of detail there will still draw the eye. So it may be worth using that as a guideline for your own drawn-in things like brickwork that you can then simplify and allude to and just not draw sections of to make sure the viewer's not being drawn away from the focal points. And just doing a bit more highlights down on the hair here and on the side as we come up and around, and just really sort of pulling that up Here it's I've got a bit of a rim light that's sort of above and behind, as well as a bit of a shine that's above and in front. It's more of a reflection than an actual light source. So this comes back to what I was saying about the difference between a reflection and lighting. You can have a reflection of a white object in a mirror, but that won't change it. It just picks up shine. And you can have both. You can have, for instance, a colored plastic ball. A colored plastic ball will have a reflection mapped on it, as well as the shading from its own lighting. So there's a difference between a matte object and a mirror finish object, or an object that has a reflective layer. And so here I'm just getting my brush to work, there we are, on the shines on the collar. And with the shines there, I'm just doing some really hard bits of white and just pulling them towards the edges. You'll notice that with, like I was saying before, with the compression you get on an image that's being reflected, as the surface curves more and more, that reflection gets compressed like a funhouse mirror. And so when you're wanting to make something look like glass or like metal, what really helps is having a lot of really hard, very narrow bits of shine and shading towards the edges of those objects, more than what happens on the broad surfaces. Reflections are about those really high contrast details around the edges of an object. And so here I'm doing a bit of shine down the sort of top bit of the sleeve there. And again, trying to be simple with it, trying not to get too stuck in on detail. I don't want to make this a big visual feature. I just want it to be there and communicate well enough. As far as how to work out the shapes to do for it, it's not actually very hard. What I mean by that is you basically just make blobs that will follow the flow of where the fabric would be. How do you figure out the flow of the fabric? Great question, person I made up. I do have a video on how to do clothing and clothing folds. It really breaks this down fairly well. It, like all my other videos, has homework as well, so you can have a go of that. Now I'm just getting a bit more here. One of the other things with having that alpha mask on my highlights layer is I can't shade outside the image, but I can definitely overblow it for internal shapes. So things like where the the sleeve is coming up in front of the body, that there I can shade outside, or do highlights outside the line, so I have to manually sort of pull that in. And here I'm just doing Mortal Kombat with the edge of the shine. I'm having come up the sleeve here. Yes, I apologize, both the recording for voice and the image itself has been recorded while I've been a bit under the weather, so my efficiency is not shockingly high, but we get through it. And I guess that does bring me neatly to the idea of the importance of having a very, very well-defined process. So if, like me drawing this, you're at a point where you don't have access to your full level of concentration, what can be really helpful is having a process that you've done enough that it becomes automatic, that you can do it nearly in your sleep. And you do that by essentially canonizing your process into a very, very specific set of steps, and then you follow those steps very, very strictly, well, not very, very strictly, but very regularly, to the point where it becomes intuitive and ingrained. Now, for me, I always still forget things, so I have my steps on an actual text document that I have open on another desktop, and I will actually just straight up check them off as I finish each step. This has really helped me become a lot faster, and I do recommend you go through your process and write down what steps you have in how you get from the beginning of the image to the finished image. What you do. Do you have a sketch layer? Do you then have a step where you do refined sketching? Do you have another step where you do your inking? Do you have more than one inking step where you add line weight like I do? Or do you just do all of it at once because you're clever that way? Whatever you do, have those steps written out so that you're not jumping back and forth between each step. Like if you've jumped to your highlights but you realize some parts of your shading needed doing, having yourself have to sort of sign off before you move on to the next step is really important. Now here I'm just doing a bit of the shine on the gloves. You'll notice that the shine gets really, really narrow towards the front there, and it sort of broadens where the hand broadens because it's based on the shape that the reflection is on. So if you imagine the reflection on a large large sort of chrome sphere versus the reflection on a small chrome sphere, the reflection will be a different size. So the direction and size of the surface plane where the reflection is present is what decides how big it is. And that's why you'll notice the little details of shine on the seam there are quite narrow, especially in the bottom bit of the palm on the hand on the left. You can see there's a very narrow bit of shine there, but it works because that's the curve of the seam coming in. Now I'm just doing the shine on the back of the hand here, on the hand on the right. And again, I don't have to worry about sort of shading outside the lines, which is really handy. And then just a little bit of shine where things come forward. And a bit of a rim shine there where it's sort of picking up that backlight. And just having to sort of manually delete some of that out without going too far, that I delete that sort of line there. That's coming out quite neat. And there on the thumb as well. I don't want to do too much shine, I say, having done too much shine, because if you have shine everywhere, you have sort of shine nowhere. Shine can be most effective when it's used more limitedly. In this case, though, I'm showing two very detailed, shiny PVC gloves with a lot of crease and fold, so the amount of shines that are going to be present here is unavoidable. That's fine. It gives me a chance to then offset that overuse of shine, and it is overuse, but I can offset that overuse of shine with the sleeves on the jacket and having them as rest areas where there's not as much detail. And so just doing a bit more of the shine on the jacket as well, and the sort of the fur trim. And then adding a bit on the jacket sleeve on the right hand side, where I'm trying to get the elements that would be facing forward. So you can see I've got the highlights there. As that part of the sleeve faces forward, it's thicker and stronger. But as the curve of that sleeve faces away, because it's kind of rounded and puffy and sort of modular, Michelin Man arms, as it curves away, the shine gets weaker. So that's looking okay shine-wise. I'm just going to give a sort of broad view of it to see if there's any bits that I've missed or bits I need to add or address. And now I'm going to start doing just a very simple sort of colorful background. This is going to be very abstract because I don't want to spend too much time on it. I'm going to drop a layer there. What I should have done though is switch my brush settings, or the bucket settings, to only use the editing layer. That way it won't do that sort of missing rim bit in the middle. It'll just do a blob and it'll ignore everything that's not on the layer you've got selected right now. And so now on that layer, I've got my lasso tool and I'm just making some sort of abstract, woogling sort of smear shapes. And I'll do some on the other side as well in a sec. And I'm getting back to my soft airbrush. I'm just going to fill these areas in. And that's looking okay. And now with that selection still active, I'm just going to grab and make another selection on the other side. Same thing here. I won't have to worry too much about the detail. There, I haven't held shift when adding it. If you want the sort of more than one selection to be active, you've got to hold shift when you start the click, and then you can sort of add selections to it. And now with that same purple, I'm just dropping in some more sort of smears of color, and that's working quite well. That's naturally sort of fitting with the colors from the figure. And now I'm adding in some of that yellow as well. Just that, again, that vaporwave aesthetic, that cyan and yellow and purple sort of. I think got a lot of beautiful color scheme to them. That's looking okay. And now I'm just blurring that out a little bit. So just Gaussian blur. Because I don't want, like I said before, if you've got too much like sharp edges and color contrast, that will draw the eye. This lets me have that color contrast without requiring the viewer to engage with it. It's just they're aware that it's there and the colors exist. And it lets me have a really subtle way of implying that flow from the top right down to the bottom left. Because that's where I've got the sort of the line of the shoulders coming across. The horn is pointing up into the corner. There's a lot of that sort of diagonal movement in the flow of the image. And now I'm just getting the smudge tool here to give me a bit of sort of smearing on these and give the graphics card a workout. Give it something to do with its time. Do a really big smear here on a high resolution document, and just I will have lifted the pen and gone for a cup of tea while that brush stroke lands. We are a bit more from the side there as well. And smear that one up also. and help sort of blend those colours in a little bit. It'll lower the opacity a little smidge just to sort of take some of its colour contrast away. And now I'm just going to dump a layer on top of it of a solid colour just to give it a bit of a tint, sort of a tint and glaze. And so there I've set that layer to colour burn and lowered it down just so I can give it a bit more sort of darkness and intensity. Just to sort of push it away from the more sort of pastel tones I've got in the figure. And so that's that there. Now I'm going to go and do a bit of manual tuning of some of the shading colors that I'm just not 100% feeling. So for instance, the shading on the shirt and the eye, I want that color to have maybe a little bit more blue to it. So I'm just pulling layers apart, just giving it a bit of a check to make sure that I've got sort of everything where I want it to be. All right. I'm just making my selection. I'm having trouble sort of grabbing that selection because even when I've got it set to refer to all layers, that pink is really close to the white there. I know it looks fairly different, but that pink is basically the same color. So what I'm going to have to do is just manually pull some of it, or in this case, I can just paint directly over my color controller layer if I want to do a bit of adjustment there. So I want the shirt's shading to be paler as well as being a bit bluer. A good color to have as the shading layer on white is like a pale blue. It's maybe a bit sort of dark there, but I'm just sort of seeing what kind of hue I want to have on it. And that's about the right hue. It's still a bit dark, but it's the right hue, so that's a good sort of starting step. I'm just tuning some of the colors in now, just to make sure it's sort of laying where I want it to be. And I might go over it again, but this time I'll use a much sort of paler blue in that same sort of blue family, just to get that color right. And that's sitting a much nicer sort of pale blue there, to sort of make it look like more of a sort of clean white shirt. And as well, that sort of shadow on the eyeball there. That's looking largely how I want it to look. And so here what I've done is I've made a selection based on my shading. I've got a new layer above it all set to screen. This is how I'm going to do a very easy way of doing subsurface scattering. So what subsurface scattering is, it's where light goes in where the surface is lit, bounces around inside the gooey flesh, and then comes out with a bit of red light, or reddy orange light, in the adjacent shaded area. So the best way to do that is just make a selection based on your shading, and then with a layer on top, set to screen, with a red color, you can have a bit of a red glow come out on the sort of edges of your shading there. It just helps things look a bit fleshy. It also works just fine on anything else where the light would go in and diffuse. So anything where light diffuses, you can have it go in and come out. You can have it pick up the color from what would be inside the object if you want. But at the same time, it does seem to work quite well with just sort of reddy oranges on basically everything. Getting the lightness and darkness right is a bit of a tricky bit, but yeah, that's something you can do to make things look a bit fleshier. And so now I've got a layer over the top of my ink layer, and I've bucket filled that with a sort of reddy orange, and then I've clipped that to my ink layer, and now I'm just going to tune in that color over the top of my ink layer just to soften it a bit. So I'm going to go with a sort of cool, dark purplish color. There's a few different ways you can do of having colored line art be semi-automatic as well. That's covered off in my line art video if you want to have a look at that. This one I decided to go with a fairly regular one just because we're already getting to about the 2-hour mark, and so I didn't want to sort of spend too much time on it. One thing I do want to do though is I've made a selection there on the eye. I'm just making a new layer and setting that one to glow, just to give a little bit of that color intensity and glow to that lower part of the eye. And again, switching to my sketcher, and that isn't quite doing it. But it'll do well enough. Now what I'm doing here is I'm making a layer that is essentially a cutout of the character, and I'm going to give that one a white border layer effect. The reason I'm making another layer to do that is if I do it from the ink layer, it'll have a white border on the inside edge of the ink. If I do it from the flats, it won't come out past the ink. So I'm doing that, I'm essentially making a new layer just to have a white edge. You can also do that by making a selection, expanding the selection, filling it in. The reason I'm doing it with a layer blend effect is that it lets me control the thickness of that outline without actually having to sort of paint it in to get it done. So here I'm just doing a bit more tuning on that multiply layer just to really make it into a really color blasting kind of thing. So I've made my multiply layer into a really, really hot pink, and then I'm reining that in with my color controller layer. And so that's the image basically done. From here, these are all steps that I would call sort of post-processing that we've been doing for the last couple of them. And so I've got my layer on the very top. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to make a new layer. So merge visible to new layer. And I'm going to duplicate that. Now with the top duplicate of the image, so I essentially made a flat copy of the image. I'm going to go and I'll do a filter, adjustment, I'll do a blur, and I'll blur the absolute frackle out of it. And so there you can see I'm making it real fuzzy. So this is the way I'll increase and control the contrast in an image without using the sort of contrast tools. The reason I'm going to do it this way is the contrast tools give you a per pixel adjustment to contrast, which I don't really like. I like a more regional approach to contrast. So what I'm going to do is make essentially a contrast maker. So I'll make a contrast maker layer, and that's a blurred copy of the full image, and then I'll compress that in with level correction to make this absolutely deep fried version of it, set that to overlay, and then lower the opacity down. This is a way of getting more regional contrast than just a spot contrast. Now that's one of the things you can do for that. The other thing I want to do is I'll make another copy of that merged flats layer, and I'll do another blur on it, but this time that's all I'm going to do. I'm just going to blur it and make it semi-transparent. You can see I've lowered the opacity down on that layer to about 40-something%. What this does is essentially a sort of soft focus and a sort of diffusion. You can see it when you zoom in a bit on the details there. It gives it a bit of that sort of soft look to the edge of the line art. And now, with that, we're finished. And the image is done. Though, you know, if we wanted to, we can always go back and make changes. Since the image is ours and we get to decide if we want to change, you know, we can change anything, and it's never too late because I have all layers separated, and post-processing layers only take a few seconds to do. So that's the image. Now, if you've been following along, I would absolutely adore seeing your image in the homework section of the Discord. I do look through all of them. I don't get a chance to give feedback on all of them anymore because I've decided to drown myself in work. But I do go through all of them. I see them. They're fantastic. And if you'd like to have a go at more of these one-to-one speed draw-alongs, I've got a whole playlist of them over here, and they grow day by day. I think there's like 8 or 9 now, or maybe you're watching this in the far future and there's several thousand, and I'm a brain in a jar that does nothing but these all day. Who knows? But I've also got a bunch of tutorial videos on how to draw different things in different ways. We've talked about a few of them through this, like, you know, the shine, shading, clothing, etc. And that's all in one big playlist called My Lessons in Order. Or you can just look at the individual lessons one by one if you'd like that. Now, if you've done that and you want to post in the Discord, I would love to see you in there. And if you want to support the channel, like, subscribe, leave a comment with what you'd like to see in these videos or the tutorial videos I do in future. So any feedback there is always appreciated. And anything else, just comment on your favorite recipe for apple pie for the algorithm. Otherwise, I will see you. It's been great painting together, and I'll see you in the next one. Have a good one. Cheers.